I'm Diane Morrison. I'm your host today, and I have some wonderful guests who I will let them introduce themselves. We'll start, I think, with Kat because we've had her on the show before.
Hi, I'm Kat Rambo. I am a writer and editor. I have written mostly, I don't have any cyberpunk novels, but I do have a number of stories that fall in that line, depending on how you define cyberpunk. Because I've had people insist to me that cyberpunk is a specific historical period, and that since we're writing in 2018, you can't do it anymore. And I am the current president of SFWA. So I'm always interested and happy to appear on these YouTube broadcasts.
I'm so glad you could join us today. You're one of my favorite people to talk to. So lots of fun. That's great. Thanks for coming. I'm looking forward to it. I understand you did some academic work on what cyberpunk is as well.
I did actually, when I was in grad school, I did stuff on cyberpunk and the idea of the virtual sublime. So it draws on kind of Kantian philosophy and notions of the sublime. If I were still in grad school, I would now launch into a whole bunch of lit speak and fling in some names of theorists. I'm a little rusty as far as that goes. But I've also done some amount of kind of reading of the history of the cyberpunk movement, and it's something that really interests me.
Well, that is awesome. This is the first panel that I'll have done on the show where I am strictly appearing as a fan. I have nothing to say on this as a writer or editor. I have not tried my hand at cyberpunk. I love it, but I don't do it. So I'm looking to learn lots. So thank you. And then we have Rachel.
Hi, I'm Rachel Beck. I'm a cyberpunk author. I write the Glitch Lug series, and so far 2 books are out, and I'm working on the 3rd right now.
That is awesome. It looks really cool. I'm sorry I haven't read it yet, but I was checking out your Amazon page when I was doing the bio for the description, and I'm like, okay, this definitely sounds like my thing. So cool.
Excellent.
Thank you for coming. Right
Thank
on.
Yeah,
okay. Oh no, let's start with the basic question for those who might not know. What is cyberpunk?
Kat, did you want to jump on this one since you have the academic backing for it, or shall I start off?
Well, I'll start with a couple things. I mean, that I think one is cyberpunk is definitely science fiction, right? And it's exploring cyber, right? And all the sort of the things that we're going to do with computers and the ways that we're going to interact with computers and the way that we're going to incorporate computers. And I'm sure I will go into a rant about this at some point, but it's also, I think, important to remember that it's punk, and in that it draws on the punk movement and that sort of that anti-corporate, anti-capitalist, anti-consumerist spirit that was very much in favor of sort of individual art and as a kind of interesting movement. And I think sometimes, much like steampunk, cyberpunk has sometimes become about the surface stuff. And so if there's enough sort of glossy keyboards and, those weird flickering lights that we, have come to represent in virtual reality, it's awesome. Like you see it on television, you're just like, that's not real code. But yeah. So go ahead, elaborate on that, Rachel. I think that gives you maybe a stepping stone to start with.
Yeah, I mean, similarly to what you just said, when people ask me at conventions, like, oh, wait, what is cyberpunk? I usually say, oh, well, it's a subgenre of science fiction. It's part of the punk movement, like diesel punk, steampunk, etc. And then it, just like each of the punks concerns itself with a particular question about society in relation to the punk movement, cyberpunk concerns itself with kind of 2 things. One, the question of megacorporations and late-stage capitalism. And then secondarily, how technology both helps us and is used as another means to control us through like corporate power. And so that's kind of at the core of cyberpunk. Aesthetically, it also tends to hail back to the 80s in a lot of ways. There's a lot of neon and sort of a lot of that style, though that is changing as cyberpunk continues to develop as a genre.
Most of my familiarity runs from about the 80s era stuff. So I do tend to think of, you know, neon in dark corners and things like that. But but I like the fact that you're talking about how it's about a question, right? And we're discussing what are the possibilities to come out of these new technologies and these new societal ways of organizing ourselves, and you know, what are the long-term effects of that going to be on us as people. And I think that's a pretty timely topic right now. You know, I'm looking at all this stuff in the news, and I keep going, I read this novel in 1984. You know? So I guess you could say that cyberpunk is by definition political. Is that an observation that would be accurate?
Yeah. Yeah, I think as long as we live in a society founded on capitalism, it is necessarily commentary on our society.
Beyond question. And I think it's been interesting. I had the privilege of hearing Bill Gibson speak a number of years ago at Microsoft. And one of the things that he confessed in that was that when he was writing Neuromancer, which is kind of one of the books that sort of launched the cyberpunk movement, he actually would go down to bars down near Microsoft and listen to the developers talk while they were drinking. And he didn't know anything about computers. And so he wanted to stress that kind of like his idea of what all of this would work was sort of based on his interpretation of how the developers were talking about it. And I thought that was a sort of fascinating thing, because it really is very influential on the way we kind of see cyberspace, right? We always see it in that William Gibson light. I've got a flash piece called 10, I think it's like 10 New Ways to See Cyberspace. And so it's like, here's cyberspace as a teenage girl's bedroom, and here's cyberspace if it were a medieval village. And I just, you know, I think it's interesting to remember that the metaphor changes. And I think, gosh, I'm sort of getting straying away from the idea of politics there.
No, that's okay. You're starting a whole new thing, which I can get onto, so that's cool.
But yeah, it is. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so I did a very brief series for a while where I called it State of Cyberpunk, and I went around and I interviewed a lot of like cyberpunk authors and creators of various genres, and mediums too. I ended up talking to a lot of game designers about it, and one of the questions I asked them was this question of like, what for you is a hallmark of cyberpunk? Because I didn't want to ask them to define cyberpunk, because there's a genre war out. Like, it is cyberpunk, it isn't cyberpunk, and I don't know that was terribly productive for our purposes. But one of the interesting things that came out of it is that most of the people who grew up with sort of first wave cyberpunk, so like Gibson era type stuff, they had a lot of I don't want to say pessimism, but there was sort of this sense of like, well, we predicted that terrible things would happen, and then the things that we predicted, look at this, they're happening. Whereas if you talk to younger cyberpunk creators, because, I mean, like myself, like I'm a millennial, we were born into this era, in a sense, like, oh, that's what we know. And there's a lot of optimism about it. Like, oh, okay, we're here, and look, we still, I'd have to go look at what someone said, and I apologize because I can't cite who it was. They said, no, what I find inspiring about cyberpunk is that cyberpunk tells about this, like, fallen society, and then it specifically tells stories about the dregs of that fallen society, people who are on like the very bottom of it, and they still have these compelling stories, and they make it. So to that was very encouraging to them, that as they looked out at this sort of political landscape playing out before them, like, no, I take comfort in this. I can make it. We can still make it.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's also interesting, though, like cyberpunk has a lot of its roots in sort of the noir era as well. And just like in the noir sort of like books, you know, at the very end, the hard-boiled detective sort of turns up his collar to the rain and like stalks off into the darkness. And, you know, it's wonderful and purple and lovely. Cyberpunk tends that way as well, where people don't tend to win and like save the day and conquer whatever, you know, the mega corporations are never unseated.
Right.
They're people still turn up their collar and sort of disappear off into the rain and the oil slick and the neon. So it's not, they don't necessarily tell stories of triumph because it's not set, that's not the question it's asking. How do we conquer these mega corporations? The assumption is that the mega corporations are here to stay. How do we operate within that space?
I think that's, yeah. And I think that's,
no, go ahead.
I just edited an anthology that's, it's all political science fiction. And Alex Renwick turned in this fabulous story called Making Happy, which is about sort of, it's this woman existing in a landscape of social media, right? Where there's sort of like constantly people are liking what she's posted, and she's like, you know, like she goes in for coffee and she, you know, downloads a coupon and then posts a picture of her coffee and gets likes. And she ends up kind of going into this space that exists outside that. It's this park where there's a whole bunch of people camping, you know, and it's all the sort of, as you said, the dregs, right? The people who are existing outside the system. And she's not sure how to navigate it. And she knows if she posts pictures of it, you know, people will disapprove, right? You know, and it's a fabulous story. And I think that's one of the things that makes cyberpunk, it is not dead in any sense of the way, because we are, you know, we're continuing to navigate what does it mean to exist with these huge corporations. And like right now we've got on Twitter, like Taco Bell has a presence on Twitter, right? You know, it's just, it's so weird. So cyberpunk is still green, still has so much to say about these weird systems we live in.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I kind of think it has more to say than ever. I mean, like, because we're living some of the stuff, like you say, right, that people saw and thought, oh, that's, you know, going to be such a bad thing in the 80s. I know, right? I know. I'm like, what is this cyberpunk dystopia? This is insane. You know, right?
I live near LA. I just call it my cyberpunk city. Like, it's just, it's there 1,000%. Like, the neon is there. The beat up streets, the giant corporations, Hollywood, it's all like right there in my backyard.
Yeah, and the information aspect too, right? A lot of cyberpunk, classic cyberpunk anyway, the stuff from the 80s is concerned about what would cyberspace look like? What would AI look like? How would we interact with that? What would happen once all this information was out there? Who would control it, right? And so what have we got right now, right? We've got Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and all these guys running these massive social media empires, right? Where, you know, repeatedly you hear stuff about, oh yeah, this, you know, outright Nazi is able to, you know, post whatever they want. But this trans woman told somebody to piss off because they were insulting trans people and they got banned, the trans woman, you know, like, what is going on here, right?
Twitter is its own world.
Oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead. I'm making encouraging noises to keep you.
I mean, you know, like it's ultimately it's all about the almighty dollar, right? The big corporations. They don't ban the Nazi because the Nazi has 10,000 followers. They ban the trans woman because she's got 50. Right? That's what it is, and we all know it, right? So how do we deal with that?
That's Saladin Ahmed tweeted something recently where he was talking about the fact that there's right now an economy of hate clicks, right? Where it's, you know, people are post something outrageous and then people are just like, oh my God, how could they say this? And in the process of reacting, they are, of course, posting that headline, which means that the site that's posting it is just like, oh my God, look at all the traffic that's getting generated by this. So, I mean, part of my feeling is that you don't give these folks bandwidth if you can possibly avoid it.
Yeah, I think so one of the things that I'm fascinated about in cyberpunk and then in modern society as a correlative is this idea of automation and computers. AI is a thing, like is a facet of cyberpunk as well that often features, not always, but often. What fascinates me about it is this idea of like as we become more tech, like this question of automation of society. and of structures that we would normally consider to be human structures. So, for example, like I like to look at corporations as large, slowly functioning AIs. There was for a period of time I worked a cubicle job, and part of what we did was white label content for franchises. So I learned a lot about like franchising models and how that affects like modern business policy. And one of the big pieces of that is that you the goal is to make every person in the company an interchangeable part, because that way no one person is necessary to the company, and the company can continue to survive if someone goes on vacation or quits or, you know, has a meltdown or whatever. But the byproduct of this is that the company, in a sense, doesn't need anyone. If you do it perfectly, the humans become in these interchangeable like cogs in the machine. And that's interesting because if you think of a company at that point like a series of like command lines, like it's a series of code, right? It can function without human input. Humans are just the thing that moves the paper and takes it to the copier and types the email. But there's a set list of rules and regulations for how they ought to do that thing and what they ought to do, and you can train a person to do that, you know, within a week. The interesting thing is you then have to back up and say, what's the purpose of this computer program? All computer programs have a purpose, and it's a strictly logical one. There's no like intuition. There's no like human like, well, but you can't do blank or blank. That's why AIs are such, you know, wonderful villains in a sense, because they're these like alien entities that that, you know, we can't quite comprehend, and they're definitely out to destroy us, though maybe by accident. Companies, the purpose of a company is to make money. And so what we've done in this, if we pull off the perfect company, what you've done is you've created a slow-moving AI whose task is to create money. And anybody who's, you know, who works in computer programming or who, you know, has read a lot of AI knows that that's never going to end well, because at a certain point the robot looks at us and says, well, you're you know, taking up resources that could be used to make money. Let's do away with you, and hence we have the AI that sets out to destroy, you know, all of humanity. And that sounds a bit dramatic, perhaps, but at the same time, the core principle still holds up. Like, the purpose of a company is to make money, not to take care of people, not to better society, not to do anything productive for humanity. It's to make money. And as we continue to develop these mega corporations of increasing size and of increasing control over people's lives, we have to recognize that what we're doing is we're giving more and more power to a device whose purpose is to make money.
I'm 100% in agreement with you.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we need to get over this myth of the good corporate citizen. It doesn't exist, right? The purpose is to make money, and for the shareholders, you know, not for the workers, right?
That's it. So if corporations are human beings, they are sociopathic human beings.
In the extreme. I mean, go ahead.
It's interesting. One of the people who was our short story nominees for the Nebula Awards this year was Jamie Walls. Wrote this wonderful story called Utopia, LOL, which I highly recommend. But he also, I ran into him in the airport on the way back from the Nebulas and said, what do you do? And he said, I work for a nonprofit corporation that basically tries to figure out how to rein in AIs before they achieve too much power. And I was like, dude, you know.
That is the most cyberpunk thing I've heard today. That's amazing.
That is cool. Awesome. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? You know, again, right, we're talking about AIs, we're talking about automation, right? We see the effects of automation and how a lot of, you know, the normal basic working person's job, right, is being, you know, dealt with by more and more automation. And so there's less and less work for people who are already struggling to get part-time work, you know, and what's going to happen in the future? Like, we cannot continue on a labor economy if labor has no value, right? And I don't know why people aren't planning for this in the large corporate structures. Who's going to buy your stuff, man? Right? Nobody's going to buy your stuff because we can't afford it now, you know? Right? No. So what's going to happen from here? And these are all, this is all part of the genre that, you know, I really got involved in when I started reading it in the 80s. Yeah. And I you know, we see it more and more. So, and that brings me to another question. Where do you see, where is cyberpunk now? And where do you see it going? Like, what are the things that it is talking about right now in particular?
I think it is attacking the kleptocracy. I think it is attacking the power structures. Still, at least the good stuff is attacking the power structures and questioning it. And I'm trying to think of a really good one that I read recently called, it's Connect by Julian Gao. And I'll give you a bunch of links to post with the description. But it's a little bit like a Ready Player One, but a more complicated one. So, Rachel, do you have examples? I'm sorry, I live on a busy street.
So hey, sirens, and we're having a conversation about cyberpunk. Somehow I just don't think it's inappropriate.
It's ambiance.
That's right.
I mean, so I think like there's a number of conversations happening. One of them is the AI conversation, which we've already touched on. People are looking like, hey, we're continuing to automate. We're creating these AIs. What do we do? Like, there's no such thing as a benevolent AI. So how do we manage that? And then the question of what it means to be human is something that cyberpunk cannot get away from.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that like deeply fascinating to me because in a sense you would think of all of the genres. A genre focused so much on tech and how we like become interconnected with tech would be the one that was least concerned with whether or not we're human. But it's quite the opposite, actually. You look at things like Ghost in the Shell. You look at, I mean, even like, I don't know, it struck me as odd when I read Neuromancer, because we've talked about that one already. That moment where he's like, oh, in the old days, men called up demons by knowing their name. And this like sort of return to our origins, even as we plunge forward into tech, mm-hmm. in the same light. Like in a sense, we look at how far we've come, but then see ourselves again, like over and over and over. And that question that haunts certain books, especially books that deal with the question of transhumanism, at what point have you ceased to be human? When you like begin applying all this tech to your body, is your body what makes you a human? Or, I mean, in the case, if I go back to Gibson again, there's this one line, I think Molly looks at this like insanely rich person who's figured out how to live forever. This like because he's so rich that he can just keep going and going and going through various technology. And she looked at him, and the line says, and she realized in that moment that the rich were no longer human.
Oh, yeah.
So Gibson no longer, at least as far as Gibson is concerned, he doesn't place it in whether or not you have a body or not. There's something fundamental, something about the need to survive that makes us human. And different games and different books obviously answer that question differently. But it's a big question that fascinates cyberpunk as it moves into this technological future. And then, of course, there's the question of how do you deal with corporations? Like, how do we deal with late-stage capitalism and its effects?
Absolutely. And I would, Inali Newitz's Autonomous, which just came out last year, is, I think, a really good example of how cyberpunk still appears and still is talking about gender and still is talking about economics and still is talking about power and still is talking about kind of the little pockets of sort of crime and resistance that live at the edges, right?
Yeah.
It's fabulous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, oddly enough, if you are competing with a very large machine, and you are one of the pieces in that machine, your best solution is actually to be the thing that the computer cannot be. To have emotions, to care when it does not profit you, to be in a sense irrational, qua the pursuit of money and even self-interest. Yeah. Like the corporate machine, this pursuit of money is largely built on the basis of like self-interest. Like, no, but if the person, like, they want this thing, so we can motivate them in this way. Like, everyone has a cost. You can always buy somebody out, whether it's with stuff, whether it's with, hard cash, whether it's the title, like whatever it is, you can buy somebody out and you can get them to submit to this system. The solution is, at least perhaps in part, to act not out of self-interest, to act out of that humanity that maybe saves us from the monster that we've built for ourselves.
It's very interesting that, like, in recent years, we now have all these television series talking about what it means to be human. We're just watching Humans, in fact, on Amazon Prime, which it just like, and in Black Mirror, if you watch like recent episodes of Black Mirror over and over, this is a question that keeps coming up, right? What does it mean to be human? And I don't know. I mean, one of the things that's happening now, right? We all sort of like, are we living in a computer simulation that's breaking down, getting weirder and weirder? More credibility to that notion than there used to be.
Yeah, I remember when that was the big, you know, everyone was like, oh, the Matrix glitched. Yeah, it was.
That's it. That's it. Remember, we were all like, oh, Philip K. Dick, he's just so wild and wacky and out there. And now we're like, ah, what did you know, Philip K. Dick? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll be curious to see if it sparks sort of a return to like philosophy and things like that. I mean, Descartes, in a sense, already handled the Matrix problem, or at the very least made a stab at it back with his whole like Cartesian doubt process.
Right.
And that question of like, wait, but can we trust our senses, et cetera, et cetera? And as tech becomes increasingly, I mean, so like even with the news now, like what can we trust with our senses is like a big question of our own world and of cyberpunk. Like if somebody has the ability to control the spin, like I occasionally do this exercise to sort of keep myself like attempt to keep myself informed, where I'll like take a news story and I'll attempt to track down every single article that I can find, regardless of who wrote it, regardless of like what the background, you know, etc. Just as much information as I can, as many data points to see if I can triangulate on the event. And it's really hard. Like it is incredibly difficult to get a fact about what actually happened. Even like I assume an event happened to precipitate all these articles. But at the end of the day, like it becomes the deeper you get in the weeds, the harder it gets to tell. Like I don't know. Like unless I was there and saw it with my own eyes, and even when I see it with my own eyes, I don't necessarily know the story behind how we got to that moment. Like nothing exists in isolation. And that's another fascinating question you have to talk about in relation to virtual reality. Virtual reality is not, oh, it's because we're all wearing glasses and, you know, special glasses, or we have our heads jacked into computers or what have you. It's this question of like, no, what do you do? Like, what's real? Yeah. How do you actually go about gathering reliable information in an era where that's at a premium?
I had a good object lesson in this, like just recently, right? A couple years ago, Canada passed this law. It was basically our version of the Patriot Act, right? Which I protested, and a lot of other people protested. And where you got your information, right, painted a completely different picture. And it was even subtle things like the choice of the photograph that they used to go with the article, right? The right-wing newspaper, right, or the even the middle of the road newspaper, right, had, you know, this picture with a misspelled sign and people in like, you know, like 2 or 3 people in crazy, you know, kind of out there hippie outfits. And, you know, it didn't look like it was a real close focus, so you couldn't tell how many people were there, right? And it seemed like it went out of its way to make people look as, you know, flaky and you know, uninformed as possible, right? And then you had the left-wing newspaper, and there's this massive crowd. This was the same event, right? This was the same event. They were both reporting on the Vancouver protest, right? Yeah. Huge crowd. Thousands of people, signs everywhere. Most of them were professional, like, you know, like that alone, right? So you're right. And of course the tone of the article was completely different. The clickbait headline was completely different. You know, so what is reality? How can we, like you say, Rachel, right? Like who's controlling the information? Right. What do they have to gain by spinning the information in a particular way? Right. And unfortunately, you know, because we're questioning this, we're starting to question the nature of, I think, logic and science in general. Right. Because it's hard to tell, you know, like, you know, for a fact that the big money corporations are going to spin things to be of advantage to big money corporations. They were all in favor of this new law, of course, because this gives them more information that they can freely access about their clientele, right, which they can then use to market to us. So naturally, they want more access to and less privacy, right? Of course they do, right? And so they were all in favor of it. So only a couple of, people go, oh, those stupid lefties or whatever, right? Those were the ones who were actually saying how many people showed up at the protest, because that was a number that was really obscured, right? And, but then again, these are the same newspapers that occasionally go off on conspiracy theories. So you don't really, how reliable is everything,
Yeah.
But oh no, go ahead. Yeah.
Jon Stewart used to do that fabulous segment on the Daily Show where he'd show just a whole bunch of people doing the same talking point, and it would be clear that they were all reading off the same press release. And he would just do that over and over. And you're just like, yes, there's a machine that's basically goes out and says, here are the talking points that we want you to stress. And what is it, lately, didn't they have to recite a loyalty oath? A whole bunch of people in one station, one series of station, they had to all get on and be like, we pledge ourselves to the freedom of the press. And in sort of, I think, a robotic monotone that may have been optional. Yeah. But it's, one of the things that occurred to me is we talked about kind of sort of to tie this back to us as writers. One of the things that fiction does is it teaches empathy. And that is our greatest weapon, going back to what you said, Rachel, about kind of, celebrating the individual and making art and doing the things that machines can't do. And empathy is, I think, one of the greatest human strengths. And
storytelling.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think stories, they're deep in our DNA. Like you can't, you go back to, I have a friend who's, she's an artist. She went to art school, the whole 9 yards. And her favorite thing when she's explaining art history to people is to say, okay, so the cave paintings, they were selfies for cavemen. And no, art is about self-expression and it's about self-reflection. And it's this whole question, in a sense, of us questioning ourselves. What is it to be human? And then it's simultaneously expressing our answer to that. We're story creatures. We want to tell what happened. And so, yeah, just like you're saying, as authors, we can sort of keep the candle of humanity, or the torch of humanity, lit by continuing to tell the stories and to be interested in the stories of people who are not told. To say, oh, okay, this story is being told about this people group, about these people, this is who they are. Let me tell you a story from the other side of it. Let me help you build a three-dimensional view of this person. And at the end of the day, we may still disagree, the two of us, but it is important to understand what you disagree with and before you disagree. I'm a teacher, so one of the big things that I run all my students through is a lot of bias training. I think that that's imperative. By 4th grade, most of them have phones and unfettered access to the internet, and it's truly bizarre. But as a result of that, it's becoming increasingly important early on to help them to weed out bias, to weed out motivation, and to just, weed out fact from fiction on a purely does that seem reasonable to believe? I know that person told it to you, but does it seem reasonable to think that? And I think that's so essential to help them see all sides of the world.
I have a friend who is a philosophy professor, PhD, got tenure, the whole bit, right? And he wrote a book recently called Reclaiming Civilization. And his goal was to teach critical thinking skills through a lens of empathy, which he thinks are lacking in our culture. People aren't learning it, right? And, so yeah, there's something that might address, right, in an academic form anyway, some of these problems that we do try to communicate as writers. I think it's one of the strengths of science fiction that you can take something that is a really emotional problem, something where people get very tense about what's going on now, and you can put it in a different setting or another planet or a different future, and you can give people some distance. And then maybe they can think about it in a way that the, frenzy they're whipped up into for their emotional reaction at the time, right, may not give them, right? So that's something that I think is really useful. And I like the way you're saying about, we're talking about the people who don't get talked about, right? The people on the fringes, right? Yeah, for me, that was a big thing about Cyberpunk, right? One of the first, I'm going to turn down my volume because I hear an echo, but one of the first major Cyberpunk pieces I encountered was Joan D. Vinge's series on what, I don't know, her Scion series. I forget what she called it specifically. Right, Alien Blood is what she called it, right? And the protagonist was a guy named Kat, right? And Kat was like a half alien from one of the first alien species that humans had encountered that were also, intelligent, sentient, and whatnot, who they managed to almost completely wipe out, right? And only these people with drabbles of Hydran DNA still remained, right? And it was, he started as like this, street kid in this horrible poverty, and just the contrast between the economic inequality, because he had an opportunity to interact with some of the higher, rich world of, the rarefied people who were owners of these big corporations and whatnot, right? That ran everything. And just fascinating, like this, that idea. Obviously this is a story about racism and about people of mixed heritage who come from different cultures, and what that might mean in a colonialism kind of framework, right? And that's what she was talking about, along with technology and what it means to be human and so on. But that's an example that I can personally think of taking something that was going on then and putting it in a different setting and giving it some distance. And I don't know, I think that's really cool. Do you guys have other, are there things you can think of through your own work or through other people's work where you think there's an important issue that's going on right now that you're trying to examine by giving it some distance?
It's hard to give distance to Cyberpunk.
Yeah.
It's right here. It's in our laps. It's in front of us. I will say, at least if we're allowed to cite our own work, my own work is concerned with like the predicating idea is what in a society where everything is for sale, the last act of rebellion is giving a damn about other people.
Right.
That's the premise, because it's you can't buy. If you pay a person to do it, you would buy necessity, and they don't actually care about that person. They care about the money. So it's sort of your last act of defiance is to care.
I love that. I think that is. I kind of want to stress something that you said before earlier, because I just thought it was so smart, which is that idea that we simultaneously ask what it means to be human and answer it. And I think that is just at the core of writing so deeply that it's just, I'm celebrating it briefly. I think, yeah, that's fiction is about what is, we're monkeys at heart, and we want to know kind of like what are the other monkeys do, and what's a successful way of navigating life and what is not. We yearn to know what's going on, and we love other lives. We love being able to escape into them, and the ones that we learn from, I think, are the ones that are the best.
Well, and to hail back to what you were saying earlier about empathy, I think that one of the most important things that we can do as storytellers, as writers in general, and then especially within the realm of cyberpunk, is to have that discussion, like essentially to model good emotional intelligence, because that's something that often gets lost in the dialogue and in even our like modern educational system. Like there's a and like we understand like there's a high value on reason. And I think that's good. Like we should value rationalism and being like reasonable human beings. But too often that's set up as the opposite of good emotional intelligence and good like good sentiment, if you will, like a well-trained emotional smartness. And they're not opposites. They're both intelligences. Like look at Gardner's theory of intelligence. Like they're both intelligences, and they're both incredibly valuable right now, because what happens sometimes in this attempt to hyper rationalize, partially it lends us ourselves back to that whole automation process a little bit, it tells us that one of the core things that makes us human, our emotions, doesn't matter. And that's an incredibly dangerous space to find oneself in. It dehumanizes, because it dehumanizes ourselves, it robs us of so many experiences as a result of that. If you can't enjoy, you know, the grandeur of a sunset because emotions don't matter, then you've been robbed of the sunset, right? And so that happens on like on a very micro level, and that whole like robbing you of that thing. But it actually, at least in my experience, makes you more susceptible to the thing that it was perhaps trying to prevent you from. Like the push towards rationalism has been out of reaction to like propaganda and like high emotional propaganda. Like, oh, we don't want people to be susceptible to this propaganda. And we saw this happen at the end of World War II as well. Like people had a strong reaction to the propaganda of World War II. Now, currently, we're having a strong reaction to the political propaganda that exists. And so there's this temptation to say like, no, people who have these like strong emotions are just people who are easily led by rhetoric. You know, whatever that happens to mean at that particular moment. And whereas that actually makes them more susceptible to it, because we are humans and we do have emotional needs. And then understanding those both makes us more susceptible to it because we don't have any framework for it. And secondarily, it builds this this like automatic fail-safe to discredit someone. Like, oh, well, they're just being emotional. It doesn't matter what they were saying. It doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if you can assign. It's where a lot of the snowflake language comes from, or the like, oh, like, I mean, as a woman, she's just being an emotional woman. Like, I've encountered that before. I'm sure we all have. Okay. Right? Like, right? Yeah. A lot of empathy right here. Yeah. It's a built-in, like, if somebody wants to control you, look, it's a very easy flip to switch. Like, oh, I want you to not listen to that person. Well, they're being emotional. Do you see that? Oh, well, clearly then, you know, you as the intelligent person knows that emotions, I don't know, you are above such things. And it's very easy to sort of guide you around by the nose. And so that's, I think, another really, really essential part of this storytelling. Like, there've been all these studies that show that kids who read have higher emotional intelligence. And the same is true as adults. Like, you read and you read broadly, you develop better emotional intelligence. And I think that's one of the greatest services that we can provide to people right now, is this thing which is at a premium.
Yes. Beyond question.
I think setting these up as opposites is actually logically very short-sighted. Right? Hear me out. No, seriously, I got to think. Go on. Sometime I'll try to make it short, but no, I mean, seriously. Okay, empathy developed as a human survival skill, right? Why do we have it, right? So that we're not the only ones taking care of us, right? There's other people taking care of us, right? There's people taking care of us as children. We're looking after each other as adults. One of the big things that I think confronts us is we're basically forced to live in these nuclear families now. You can't have these big extended families, you know, anymore. And you know, so we don't see this as much as we used to. But the whole condition for every monkey in the band gets better if all the other monkeys are contributing to make it better, right? If you can do more as a group than you can individually. We understand this when we teach this in biology, right? You know, oh yes, these were evolutionary skills that we developed, and you know, this is why the primates are a high animal. And then we take it out into our culture, right? And it's like, oh, well, you know, you're being emotional, so clearly you're not actually thinking about things long term. Dude, if you, you know, like, if you're making a better world for everybody, it's a better world for you too. If you're taking care of other people, they will take care of you. You know, not all the time, but most of the time, right? So if you're not thinking about it in terms of empathy and trying to appreciate another person's perspective, right? Then you're just shooting yourself in the foot, right? Sooner or later, these guys who are like sucking up all the world's money like giant vacuum cleaners, you're going to run out of money, right? And everybody else will have developed a trade economy or something by that point. We'll have gone back to barter because we have no money, so we can't operate that way, right? And then how are you going to eat, right? Because we're going to go, oh no, you're the asshole who took my house. I got nothing to say to you, you know? Seriously. Right? It's short-sighted not to be empathetic.
It is.
Well, and it's funny because we've already, at least among millennials, a lot of us have already shifted back towards not even a barter system, but that herd mentality that like your social network is your safety net. Like, so for instance, like I graduated at the height of the recession. There were no jobs. So like you were entirely dependent on all of us who had no jobs sharing what we did have in order to survive. Or like even more recently, like last year, we were in a car crash. It wasn't our fault, but the driver who hit us was uninsured. And so the insurance company immediately went to war trying to do everything possible not to pay out, because they didn't obviously want to pay, because their job is to make money, not spend it. The problem, so eventually there was a payout, but it was 2 months later. And if I hadn't had like my social network of friends who bless them, took me to work every single day for weeks, and like helped, people pitched in and helped us buy like a new car to like temporarily hold us over until the paperwork got started, all of that, I would have been out on the street very, very quickly. Like, it's not a hard cascade. Like, I wouldn't have been able to get to work, so I wouldn't have made rent, so I would have been evicted. Like, that was just a very short trip without a social net to catch you. And that's largely what we can rely on. Like, heaven knows I can barely afford, like, I can afford the healthcare so I don't get taxed on it. But, like, if this, in a society that runs on money, you cannot trust that system to catch you.
Yeah.
It's core survival even now to have that network of people.
Maybe it's why I tend to identify with the millennial perspective a lot. I'm what you call Gen X, right? But when I graduated, it was 1993. And at that time, Canada was in, like they were calling us an honorary third world country, right? This is how bad our economy was. One guy I know started looking for work in Vancouver and moved all the way. He didn't find any till he got to Toronto.
Oh, right? My lands.
Right? So this is what it was. So I had nothing. Right? Nothing. And I still have nothing because I had nothing to build on, right? So yeah, for me, it's always been about, let's all pitch in and rent a place and I'll sleep on the couch, right? That's our reality, right? So I get it, and we wouldn't make it without each other, right?
Exactly.
So,
yeah, exactly. We need that emotional connection.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think kind of we've reached like the lull here with that one. I don't really know where to go with that.
I know.
We're all on the same page here.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What got you into Cyberpunk first? Like, I'm always curious to hear people's like origin stories with Cyberpunk.
I'm trying to think I know that the first story that I wrote that I thought of as Cyberpunk, I wrote because I was curious about sort of economic issues. And so I wanted to kind of write about what it was like to, it's basically, it's called Memories of Moments, Bright as Falling Stars. And it's basically about a society where if you can pay for bodily modification, you're golden, right? And it's basically the kids have to have this sort of college placement test. And if you're one of the kids who can afford memory modifications and all of that, you're going to do fine. And so these two underclass, kind of very lower class kids who are scrounging discover a bunch of memory, and that they can sort of install in themselves. And they kind of basically, it's these long loops that you lay in your skin, and they look like tattoos and all of that. And then of course somebody comes looking for it.
Oh yeah.
But I wanted to really sort of talk about that, because I came out, I went to the University of Notre Dame, and then I got a master's from Hopkins, and then I taught at Towson and Indiana University, and I became aware of these huge discrepancies in the educational system, and where it really was, where the kids who could afford private school are really advantaged, right? The kids that I had at Hopkins that had, their parents had a lot of money to throw into their education had a big advantage over the kids whose parents were working, and they were latchkey kids, and it's shitty. And so that's what I tried to write about. I'm sorry, that's a very long-winded way of saying economics, right? Economics.
Yeah, but like economics and also like your own personal experience. Like that's always the angle that I'm curious about. Because usually there's something that happens in a person's life where they're like, oh, I had this experience and now I get it. It clicks for me. I resonate with it.
I think for me, part of it was working in information technology and working in network security, and just being aware how important data was. I mean, I was like a very early net person. I was on the sort of the internet back in 1990, sort of very, very early. And I've always been fascinated by it. And I know that my life is very, like, I met my husband because of the internet. I met my best friend because of the internet. I got many of my jobs because of the internet, you know. So, yeah.
I was the kid everybody made fun of in school, right? So naturally, I was drawn to tales of other outsiders, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was not hard for me to develop empathy because, you know, hey, I felt pretty crappy a lot of the time, so it's not fair for me to make other people feel crappy too, right? And that led me into realization of things like issues of racism and economic inequality, right, and ableism and all of that stuff. So for me, the reading of the Cyberpunk led to the politics as opposed to politics leading to the Cyberpunk, which I guess is kind of a reverse. But I was very young when I came to it. Like I was that kid that read everything in the library and needed more, right? So, yeah, so I ended up, you know, with an adult card at the public library at the age of 10. And, you know, I was in the intermediate library at the age of 6 instead of the primary library. And, you know, that was me, right? So yeah, right. So I thought about it earlier than a lot of people do, I think.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
And what about yourself? That's a very good question to ask you too.
So let's see. For me, it was so before I hit the moment of cyberpunk. My background is in. I had written primarily fantasy before that, and like consumed almost exclusively fantasy. I had a brief stint into steampunk, which I thought was like amazing, and that was this lovely discovery. And then my other background is that I got my undergrad in communication theory. And that did a lot to sort of open my eyes. One of the big things that communication theory is concerned with is who has the right to speak. Because so much, I won't go into the jargon of it, but basically when we communicate with symbols, and who controls the meaning of that symbol ultimately has power in society. So the question then is, who has the right to control that symbol? How is that symbol controlled? And who has the right to, because those symbols, you know, favor of one group over another group necessarily. How do we deal with that as a society? It's like fundamental to communication theory. So I had already sort of been preceded with these ideas. And then I graduated at the height of the recession and was just doing whatever work I could to try and survive. There was a point where I was working like 4 jobs and still not making rent. And that was disheartening beyond words. But I was working and then I finally landed in a cubicle, which at least made rent. And that was like my big success. Like I was making rent, and not, you know, still working 12-hour days, but at least I was making rent. And sort of in the midst of that, this growing frustration, like, oh, wow, I'm surviving, but but I'm staring at the inside of a cubicle every day. And my task is to make large corporations more money. And it was like soul crushing. And then I discovered Cyberpunk actually I played a ton of tabletop RPGs. And it was a game called The Sprawl by Hamish Camerons. And my husband was running the game, and one of their players couldn't make it. He's like, hey, can you jump in? And I was like, well, what do I do? And he's like, well, you can play this number of things. I was like, I will play a hacker. And I jumped in and it resonated. I was like, oh, because it felt honest. And that was the big, moment, because so much of my day-to-day was like smiling, you know, and wearing the face and being told, like being fed nonsense, like things that I knew were not true and things that I knew were like to appear good. My former CEO, his previous job had been as a motivational speaker. So it was, you know, it was a lot of talk and not a lot of action. And it was this like growing frustration, and to have a genre that said, no, the company is not out for your major good. The CEO is lying to you. And I was like, I knew it. I told you so. It was this like moment of like somebody was finally saying the thing that I knew but did not either have words for or could not say because I would get fired. And so there was this deep resonance of like, yeah, the company is out to make money. That is ultimately our purpose. We have all this fluff about like, no, it's to help the small businessmen and to help people accomplish their dreams. And you know, for, you know, this cheap price a month, you too could be, like, it was nonsense, and I hated that. And so I got deep into cyberpunk at that point, just like sort of dove in head first. And, you know, was very, very shortly after that was able to quit and become self-employed. And so there was an escape there too. But yeah, that's basically my origin story for cyberpunk.
I totally resonate. One of my early cyberpunk experiences was a game called Shadowrun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have been, you know, RPGs for forever, tabletop RPGs.
Excellent.
Right, and my job that got me out of the I can finally make rent, right, was as a taxi dispatcher, which is a soul-killing, horrible place where people are rude to you and make up bullshit all the time. And you have no right to say anything to them, right? You're like, oh, well, we'll send you a taxi back. And you're like, I know you weren't fucking there. I know you weren't, because you're full of crap. I deal with you all the time, you know? Right? You know, and
yeah, no, there's like a certain rage that accompanies most like cyberpunk origin stories that I resonate with. Like, no, it should not be. And like, I'm being lied to.
I get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's that moment where you realize you are just a cog in the machine. Right?
And it comes back around.
It's true.
Oh, that's good. Cool. That's, well, we're building our empathy here. I'm there. I'm like, yes, sister. Oh, that's so cool. Okay. So this brings me to something else, right? I had trouble filling this panel, right? This is something that I had real trouble organizing, and I want to know why, right? We have a lower viewership at the moment than we typically do. Now that could be the time of day, because normally we do this on a weekend and kind of middle of the day, and this is morning and it's a weekday. But I wonder, is Cyberpunk still popular enough that you can focus on it, right? And has it declined in popularity? And if so, why?
I mean, it's been my experience thus far, and this could be a limited experience. Like, I only started publishing in Cyberpunk like a year and change ago, so newbie acknowledged. But the thing that I found at conventions, because I do a lot of conventions, that's where I sell most of my books, is that there's a lot of hunger for it, but no one's making it. There's been a beginning movement towards it. Like, Netflix has released a couple, like, it had like Altered Carbon. And like, there's been like motions towards it, and the aesthetic of a lot of films is changing towards a more cyberpunk aesthetic. And there's like a huge hunger for it. Like, when my like quick and easy, if I can say like, oh, hey, do you like cyberpunk? And the person says yes, they're like immediately starved for it, because there just isn't enough of it out there. But at the same time, outside of that, people are like, I have no clue what that is. Which is great, because then I get to introduce them. I'm like, here's what you're missing. And it's wonderful. But I'm not, in a sense, surprised that you had a hard time tracking down creators, because, like, I mean, I just tried to do this with the State of Cyberpunk thing, and I found some names, but honestly, I had more success in the tabletop game industry finding people who both wrote in Cyberpunk and were willing to talk to me than in books, which was like a huge surprise to me. I figured authors would come out of the woodworks, and they just didn't.
Right. Huh.
I don't know, Kat, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Sorry, trying not to hang up as I unmute myself. No, I think that's really smart, and I think, yeah, it's not going to become less relevant anytime soon, you know, and if, you know, may even become more so. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me, because I think there's also a kind of nihilistic branch of cyberpunk, right? Where it's kind of like, let us just sink into despair and embrace the cold, black heart of the machine. And so I kind of resist that particular impulse, but which kind of goes back to that noir, right, that you were talking about at the beginning, and then turning the collar up to the brain. you know, one of the movements that I hear mentioned every once in a while is now hope punk, right?
Yeah.
Which is just, and I think I would like to see us, I mean, can we mash it all together? You know, we love our mashups in fantasy and science fiction. Can we make it cyber hope punk or something like that?
I actually have this theory that superheroes and cyberpunk are maybe, sorry, this is about to be a digression, are maybe the same premise with different worldviews. And here's my thinking, here's my reasoning. They are both about the use of power. And like cyberware, if you will, typically mirrors superpowers, right? We have super strength, right, we have like our cyber arms, we have our like telepathy, we hook ourselves into a computer and speak anywhere all over the world. We have like, there's a lot of correlatives. We have super speed when we have our bio legs and so on and so forth. Superheroes are predicated on the idea that if you give a person power, usually that power comes from the outside, right? Like they're given a gift, a spider bites them, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Bruce Wayne has an obscene amount of money. But if you give a person power, your average people, or at the very least the people we tell stories about, will then use that power for good, you know, the great power, great responsibility, etc. And their first impulse is, I have these superpowers now, I should go fight crime. I should go make the world a better place. And that's the like premise of the superhero. Now, obviously there's subversions, there's Watchmen and so forth as the genre developed. But at core, that's its belief that people, when given power, will use that power for good. Cyberpunk, we built the power for ourselves. We made our own superpowers. It wasn't gifted to us, we built it. And the first thought we had when we discovered that we could make superpowers was, how can we profit off of this? How can we exploit it? We don't use our super strength to punch out bad guys. We use our super strength to lift large cargo bins and move them onto the truck. And then those two worldviews, that like pessimism and optimism about what do you do when you give a human power, is the like starting point and the divergent point for superheroes and cyberpunk, which is really fascinating to me because in the same way that cyberpunk came in large part, like there's a heavy influence of the noir genre, Batman was originally a noir like piece. He was a noir detective, and he was Gotham's greatest detective, and he went through the rainy streets and turned up his, you know, he didn't quite wear a trench coat, but he had a cape and like, you know, did the whole 9 yards.
He did the rain thing.
It's true. No, it's true. He did. And like, and a lot of good Batman actually lends, it has a very cyberpunk feel. Like a lot of the, like, especially as like Batman like continues to progress. I'm not entirely clear on what DC's doing with him right now. I think that's weird, but the like a lot of really good comics, they like, you could mistake them at a glance for cyberpunk. And I think that interplay is fascinating because society right now is clearly hungry for people who can save the world. The superhero franchise is booming like never before. And at the same time, you have cyberpunk saying like, this is what the world is. And I think that those two actually dance in a very nice way, and hold one another in tension. So all that to say is, I think the audience is there. I think that a little more dancing might be good for it.
I'm thinking now, I'm like, projects in the near future.
There we go.
Yeah.
I think another part of the reason that cyberpunk doesn't have the audience is, quite frankly, the way it's been marketed. I worked in marketing for a while, so I'm always going to look at the marketing. But like, part of the reason, one of the big reasons I wrote the glitch logs is that I wanted to be able to hand a book to somebody that was not actively antagonistic to the reader, in terms of like its like sheer level of jargon. I wanted something that could be a jumping on point for cyberpunk, because cyberpunk does be very jargon heavy, and that makes it opaque. It makes it a hard barrier of entry. And then secondly, something that I can hand to my women friends specifically without having to warn them ahead of time.
Yes.
Which is not, like, it's really hard to find in cyberpunk. I'm sure it exists. I have not encountered it, but I was running into this problem where I was like, oh, like, you should read Snow Crash. Oh, but by the way, you know, there's a statutory rape at the bottom, 2/3 mark. Like, be aware. Oh, like, here, you can read this. Oh, but be aware that this exists. And like, you have to keep getting these disclaimers. And at a certain point, I was like, what would it be like to hand somebody a book? And I could be like, well, there's swearing in it.
There you go.
Like, what would that feel like? And I couldn't find it, so I wrote it. And
write the book that you want to read, right?
I mean, essentially, and because there's not like, it's obviously we're all women here, and we're all big fans of cyberpunk, but it's actively hostile in a lot of ways to women as an audience.
There is. Yep.
And so I think that that's part of the reason that it's as small as it is. I'm saying towards women, I think it's actively hostile to anyone who, like, to any feminist, to anyone, not just women. I think I misspoke there, because, like, even my husband, who is a staunch proponent of women's rights, has to throw down cyberpunk periodically and be like, I can't read this. This is, like, sickening. I can't do this. So we need, part of it is that it's been too hyper focused at, like, one particular reader. And we are now in desperate need of that branching out and something that is accessible to more people.
Is there any, like, I'm trying to think of YA or teen cyberpunk, and I'm having a hard time. I mean, in some ways, a lot of it is, right? A lot of it is this kind of, well, no, actually.
I mean, the dystopian, I think part of the trick is that the dystopian market rose and fell very rapidly. Like, I mean, in a very short period of time. Like, in terms of fads, it was like you blinked and you might miss it.
Yeah.
And, like, they've already sort of had their stomach full. Like, dystopians are on their way out. And so, unfortunately, Cyberpunk didn't get its shot. Yeah. Like, it rose, and we had basically, you know, like, battle royale spinoffs. And that was, like, sort of the height of the you know what I'm talking about. And then it dropped off, you know.
Well, I think I do see every once in a while one of the little kind of sub genres is kind of like the premise is reality television in some way, right? You know, like, you know, they're contested on reality TV, either inadvertently or, you know, vertently, whatever the opposite of. And where it is someone from the underclass, and this is a way for them to sort of win social status or a job or, you know, the cubicle, right? It's kind of odd. Yeah, it's, man, I mean, I just, like, when I talk to millennials, I just feel like I should sit there and go, I'm so sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. I thought it would be better by now. I've done what I could. Oh, Jesus.
Well, I appreciate it.
I was just thinking, you know, now we have that. It's called the NFL. Roll your dice and see if you get brain damage.
Oh, God. Well, we do.
And the NHL now, too, apparently. This is becoming a thing because we're allowing harder and harder, you know. So I can't be all, yes, us Canadians over here about this.
Well, our house has a shameful, it's because my husband used to work on the live feeds for this, but we watch Big Brother each year, which is, you know, it's people in a house, right? And one of the things that they don't sort of let you know is those folks are they're really kind of tortured in some ways, right? They are sleep deprived. You know, a bunch of them are, you know, don't get regular food or showers or whatever. And a lot of those head of household competitions are just, I won't swear, but I would normally, just brutal, right? You know, that they really are ones where I look at them and I'm just like, oh my God, if I did that, I would be crippled for days afterwards. Yeah. And so we are kind of torturing people on television right now. I mean, don't even get me started on some of the Japanese game shows.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's true. I live close to Hollywood. I've worked in film, like, and yeah, I won't name the show for fear of litigation, but yeah, a number of like major shows, like, they're actively working to, like, hurt the contestants because they want it. They will give them better play. Right. Like, they want the soundbite, and they'll do anything it takes to get to it. Again, because we circle back around to it needs to make money, and that's what makes money. You know, the machine grinds on.
It gets lots of likes.
And what does that say about us, right? What does that say about us? That these are things to make money. Right?
Well, and the question of art again. What are we saying if art is, you know, a reflection of ourselves and what we say about ourselves? the art that we've made then, I mean, as much as reality TV, in a sense, it is art. It is a form of self-expression. There is a very particular narrative that is crafted in each and every episode. Some people are cast as heroes and villains, and that's how it works. What have we said about ourselves in that moment? Like something pretty bleak.
Yeah. That's one of the things I love about it is it's called quote unquote reality TV, but it is so manufactured out of sound bites. And often one of the things that's fascinating to me is that what's really going on is not at all what they are showing, right? They are so carefully.
Yeah.
Here we're back to the spin again. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Wow.
So all that to say, that's I think that's why you maybe had a hard time tracking down other speakers for this. But I think that, like we've said, Cyberpunk is more relevant than ever, and I think will even be well received.
Yeah.
Like I have the great joy of being able to introduce a lot of people at conventions to Cyberpunk. And I mean, at least from the letters I get, they seem to be like delighted to have discovered it. So I think that the audience is there. They just don't know yet because it hasn't been presented to them.
Maybe you have something about the marketing aspect, right? Does this tie into, Kat, at the beginning of the program, you said that you've had people argue that it's a particular historical period and you can't do it anymore. Does that relate to that? Is it part of because it's being marketed as this, 80s pop culture thing? Or
Well, okay, so let me place that because it partially has to do with a panel at a con that I'm still irritated by, which is that I was there with two people that weren't writers who basically did not let me speak, despite the fact I was the only person on the panel who'd actually written any. And one of the ways that they kind of shut me down was that they insisted that it had to be part of this historical period and that anything that anyone was writing nowadays was just derivative. I think that whenever anything becomes a game skin, it has passed into our sort of cultural vocabulary. And so I would argue that cyberpunk is there, that we do see it on, Shadowrun, I think is a really good example of that. But there's, there's like 20 million Xbox games kind of along those lines too. But is it that we just don't call it cyberpunk anymore? Is it that, when we hear the term cyberpunk, we're like, oh, that's a historical period and I don't feel like I can speak with authority on it? Is that it?
I mean, so I've encountered some of these first wave cyberpunk type people as well. I think that they're actually in the minority. Like they're maybe still part of like the old boys club, so you might see a higher percentage of them at conventions and on panels because they've just been around for a long time and so they know people. But at least in my experience interviewing these various, I ended up interviewing about 10 people about it, and the at least the conclusion I've come to is there was a first wave of cyberpunk, and like Neil Stephenson might be like the last one that you can sort of cut off on that range of like what the first wave of cyberpunk looked like. The problem is that so there's several problems. One, isolating it to just that, you would still have a hard time pinning down what is cyberpunk just based on that very small sample set, because there is they are overlapping circles in a Venn diagram, but they don't actually all share any like one trait necessarily. Maybe large corporations, at which point, then maybe cyberpunk is just fiction about large corporations, and that seems that's not quite right? So I think necessarily you have to keep going. The interesting thing I think about people who try and lock themselves into just first gen cyberpunk is two things. One is that it, consciously or unconsciously, and I want to say this very delicately, it may not be intentional, but there does seem to be a large resistance to new voices in that space. And part of that, the ability to, if you can isolate it to a time period that has already come and passed, is that you have safely avoided anyone saying anything that you do not want to hear or do not already agree with.
Yeah.
Also, I think ironically, is the same people who gripe about it being only from that era are also the most likely to gripe about cyberpunk being dead. Well, yes, you killed it because you cut it off at that point. Like, if it's dead, it's because of you. You killed cyberpunk. You know, and we circle back around to like maybe the fans are like the worst thing possible for a genre, but I don't think that's true. And I think that in a sense, gloriously, because cyberpunk doesn't have that much of an audience, because it was like, I think for a period of time being slowly strangled to death by these gatekeepers and these people who were saying like, no, it's only in that time period. Most people don't know about them. And that's glorious to me, because you can come out with all of this new cyberpunk that is still actively being written and say, oh, well, let me introduce you, and off it goes, and even refer them back to like to the origins of the series. But like, I don't know, a lot of my friends who love cyberpunk now actually got into it through RPGs, and to them, who wrote what in the 80s is doesn't matter. They love cyberpunk and they're writing it now, and like, you know, you can tell them they're not, but it's a bit silly to do so. At least that's my take on it. I think that there are some people who will go to their graves thinking that the first wave was the only wave. Yeah. But I think that that's a bit silly.
I was just looking at an anthology that I was in a few years back by Underland Press called Cyberpunk. And I know that. Yeah, and it's got, you know, it's got some good stuff in it. But one of the things they're saying is cyberpunk writers, serious, smart, and courageous in the face of change, expose the naivete, I can never say that word, of a society rushing headlong into technological unknowns. Technology could not save us, they argued, and it might in fact ruin us. Now, 30 years after the movement party crashed the science fiction scene, the cyberpunk reality has largely come to be the future they imagined is here. And I think one of the things is, it's kind of like, where do you imagine cyberpunk's future? And the fact is that it actually is a moving target. It's always going to be sort of, I think, 5 to 10 years down the line from us.
Yeah, and even maybe even that window's closing. Like, one person I talked to, he said the frustration is like, you almost can't write it fast enough. Like, you predicted and it happens tomorrow, and you're like, well, now I'm just writing current events, right? And so like the window of how far in the future you're writing is there, but it continues to be relevant. Also, and I don't know if I can say this about cyberpunk as a genre, but my own personal feelings on the subject are that if the only thing you're writing in cyberpunk is predictive stories, then maybe you should have written an essay instead, because stories are about people,
right?
And we are curious about how tech interlocks with people and things like that. But if Neuromancer is still a relevant text to read after the invention of the internet and the wireless phone, which, you know, poor Gibson never thought like, oh wait, what if we went wireless? Like, there's still cords on everything, which is, if that's still a relevant read, then I don't see why anything we write now, even if it comes true tomorrow, shouldn't still be relevant.
Right.
At the end of the day, are you telling a story with compelling characters? Do they react to, like, I mean, we talked about at the beginning, like, we go back to our roots in cyberpunk in some ways. Ultimately, if you're telling a good story, you're telling a story about humanity, and we will always be humans.
I think that's absolutely right. Absolutely right.
I have this deep thought expression because maybe I'm not giving myself enough credit. I'm writing this story. And after we've been talking about what cyberpunk is all about, I'm like, maybe it's a cyberpunk story. It's future exploration. It has to do with big corporations and asteroid mining and a person, you know, interacting with all of that and trying to do the right thing in a situation instead of doing what the corporation wants you to do in order to make money. So maybe it is a cyberpunk story. It's just I thought of it as a space story because it's happening out in space. But no, maybe not.
I mean, interestingly enough, early cyberpunk does touch heavily on space. Like, even Neuromancer like has to take place in suborbit. Like, because that question of like the space age is always like close at hand. And even during Blade Runner, it's like, oh, well, yeah, you know, most people went off to the space colonies on the space, you know, whatever planet, but we're still here. So let's talk about how bad things have gotten since everybody with money left. Like, space is still like at the very least a big portion of it. I mean, personally, I would say write it and let the fans argue about which genre it is.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Well, and I'll say next world's pretty dark. You know, like everybody went off to Mars, right? And then you read about Mars, and Mars is this, you know, desperately trying to survive, little scrabbling, you know, we don't have enough resources. God only knows if humanity's going to make it on this planet. Right? And everybody on Earth thinks, oh yeah, they went off to paradise in the Martian colonies. You know? Anyway, sorry. Yeah. Go ahead, Kat. I was amused by that thought, right?
No, I like it, and I just
they kill themselves, you know? Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. Actually,
I'm so sorry. That's totally my fault. But write it and let the fans decide what genre it is. Was the last thing.
Right, because like genre is useful, right? Mm-hmm. It's a useful category to be able to, like, I don't necessarily agree with people who say genre is dead. There is no genre, just because it doesn't do everything people thought it would, or hoped it might. It's not. But it's still a useful tool. Like, it gives us categories, and we can say, oh yeah, we are talking about this genre, talks about this particular thought project. And so it's still useful, but I don't think it has hard edges like people want it to. People like very much want it to be a box and it's nice and neat and clean and here's the edges. But like it's more like, you know, just this massive Venn diagram, and you can say, yeah, everything in this circle is cyberpunk, but it maybe overlaps with this one, and it's got like really blurry edges, and halfway in between. It's useful as a starting place, but maybe not as a place to become fixated. I think that leads to gatekeeping all too often. Who's in and out of the cyberpunk club or whatever, and that's not useful. We came here to tell stories, not to draw lines and build fences.
Well, I think there's also been a historical shift, and that where cyberpunk has often been about the critique of power structures and the critique of economic structures. I think many of us, with kind of as diversity has become more of an issue, people realize that economic diversity is part of that. I mean, and that in fact, good fiction incorporates that, right? The good fiction actually sort of reflects one of the things about the world, which is that we're in this sort of weird system where we have abstracted time and effort and made it into this kind of these coins that we pass back and forth, right? It's weird.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think one of the things that I love is that fantasy has moved, I think, increasingly towards thinking about the economics of the situation. In fact, we're kind of moving away from that idea where you have sort of the chosen one who's the long lost son of the king, and the traditional monarchy has been upset, and if that is restored, everything will be fine. And now fantasy, I think, looks more at sort of the gritty underside and the quartermasters of the companies rather than the generals, right?
Okay, let's see. We're well
coming up on time. Yeah,
we are well past time. It's like, yeah, we've been doing this quite a long time. So, but that's cool. I'm actually very excited about that because I expected this to be a short panel because I'm like, okay, we have so few people, but obviously we all have a lot to say, and that's great. A last question. Okay, so a lot of people are either discovering or rediscovering the genre, right? So do you have a couple of things that you recommend that people read to kind of get a feel for what cyberpunk is all about?
Well, I'm going to hold up this again.
Yes.
The story anthology, but I've also got another one that I was in called Cyber World, which was Jason Heller and Josh Viola. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that I think it's Cyber World, Tales of Humanity's Tomorrow. But there's also a really good anthology. I actually went through my shelves and pulled this out ahead of time. James Patrick Kelly and John Kessel have an a book called Rewired, the post-cyberpunk anthology that I think might be interesting for people to look at. And I think like nowadays that book Autonomous that I mentioned by Anna Lee Newitz is a very good one. I would also look at Ted Chiang. I think Ted Chiang is writing really interesting, cool stuff. How about you, Rachel? What are you? And you should plug your own too.
Oh, okay. So I wrote, like I mentioned at the beginning, I write the glitch logs. So if you want a nice jumping on point for cyberpunk, that's what I wrote it for. The first two, the first one's called Defrag. The second one's called Overclocked. They follow the stories of Glitch. She's a hacker. She lives in the city of Miyosaka. She makes a living stealing from giant corporations, and one day she's on a job and things go wrong, and that's where everything sort of gets off the ground. Let's see. There's swearing in it. That's my caveat, and I'm so pleased that that's the only caveat I have.
Good for you.
So if I can actually, so my introduction to Cyberpunk was RPGs, and so I think I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend some RPGs. Obviously, there's Shadowrun, which we've already brought up, which is kind of a fantasy cyberpunk hybrid, which I think is delightful. My introduction was through The Sprawl. It's a Powered by the Apocalypse style tabletop RPG. It's by Hamish Camerons. And it's excellent. Like I very much enjoyed it. It does a nice job of capturing the genre, and you can play like an entire story in just one session. So it's kind of a nice, if you just want to block out 4 hours, play through a story, you'll have like a very strong sense of like what the genre feels like by the end of that. There's also Fraser Simon's The Veil. Is another one. I think they've got another edition coming out soon. Double check that. And Hack the Planet, I know, just kickstarted, which is more environment punk than cyberpunk, but there's like some overlap there. Let's see. Reading Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash was maybe the first book I read, and it's an excellent introduction to a lot of the ideas of cyberpunk. I will give the warning: there's a statutory rape scene at about 2/3 mark, so be warned. Protect yourself accordingly. Other than that, maybe I should stop talking there. Like that's kind of a nice. I don't want to overwhelm people. Like maybe play a game and read a book, and obviously everything that Kat's recommended. That might be a good starting place for people.
Yeah. Here's a lengthy reading list. We'll include it in the program notes.
Okay. Oh, yeah, that would be awesome, Kat. Thank you very much. That would be very helpful. We will put that up. I will.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, is there anything you guys want to tell our audience about what you have coming up before we close here?
I'm going to mention that I will be next week at Gen Con, and then 2 weeks from that at Worldcon. And then 2 weeks from that at Dragon Con.
Holy crap.
So
you're going to be exhausted. Good for you. I admire your tenacity.
Should be interesting. Rachel, what about you? What do you have coming up?
So I'm in the middle of moving right now, which is why there's boxes all over the place behind me, and I do apologize for that. But let's see, next convention I'm going to be at is actually Sinister Creature Con, and that's not till October because I'm moving right now. Though I will be swinging by Big Bad Con on the way up there, if anyone wants to say hi. Cool. And then let's see, yeah. Other than that, that's mostly my life. I should have book 3 out by the end of the year, so I'm very excited about that.
Cool. What's book 3 going to be called?
I don't know yet.
Okay, that's cool.
That's the last thing I do. I'm very bad at it. But I'll put up announcements about it eventually.
Well, great. I'm running a Kickstarter. It has nothing to do with Cyberpunk.
That's delightful. What's the Kickstarter for?
It's for a print collection of a series of stories I wrote for ebook, and I'm calling it Once Upon a Time in the Weird West. So,
excellent.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was great.
A blast.
I had a lot of fun. Yeah, 10 out of 10 would do it again. I very much enjoyed this.
I will hold you to that. I will keep that in mind. I will call you back.
Excellent.
Awesome.
And thank you for those who joined us
you.
today. And of course, the archive will remain up on the channel. So if you missed it, or your friends missed it, or you came in at the end, or whatever, you can see the whole thing. Just give it about 10 minutes to finish processing. And I'm still having difficulty lining up future panels. I think it's probably because it's summer and everybody's busy and they're all off at cons and things. But things that are coming up, although I can't give you dates, right? We have let's see here. Okay, there's a panel coming up about what we're reading and what we recommend, right? So in the field, and I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be nice and low key and relaxed. I'm trying to put together a Cli-Fi panel. So if you know any Cli-Fi writers, I think now is the time to talk about it in the middle of the record summer heat wave, right? Oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
I'm going to give you a couple more game chats. I've been lining up a couple people to talk to, so look for those.
Yeah,
Get
that
off
was
my
really
butt and
popular,
finish them.
actually.
Yeah.
I noticed that it got a lot of viewership, so I think people are really eager to hear more about Game Chat, so that's cool. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.
Bye.